I introduced it briefly last week. In fact, it was my intent to get into the study of that chapter last week, but we spent more time on chapter 4 than I had guessed earlier that we would. So we're going to do our best to cover some ground that requires some computations here and there. I'm not going to get into the specific details of how those are all done, but point you in the direction of some of your own research in that area. But at the same time, try to see the broader principles of interpretation that are involved in a study of Genesis chapter 5. I've mentioned this before. In chapter 5, verse 1, the writer Moses uses an expression that he uses throughout the entire book frequently. Many have thought it's a key to like chapter divisions, if there were such. In the original book of Genesis, each would have been introduced, each new section, by these are the generations of, and this expression would be followed by an account of the life of one of the great men or families in early primeval history. So that expression is used here. I've also pointed out that some time ago, a former mentor of mine, Dr. Clyde Woods from Freed-Hardeman University, in commenting on Genesis, he wrote a commentary on Genesis through Deuteronomy, the whole Pentateuch, said that this clue here also gives us an indication he's trying to deal with literal history. Others have brought that up also. And he mentions, he brings out frequently how this is a division, topical division. These are the generations of. The same thing is said about Adam that will be said about Abraham, and we've brought that out. So it's hard really to be consistent and to say the account about Adam is in a totally different realm out here in a metaphorical sphere or allegorical. Whereas the account of Abraham, it attempts to be literal or straightforward history when you have the very same expression. So that's just one consideration. And then we're going to go into see, now last week when I introduced this, I did a little bit of preaching and mentioned how that a young lady took her grandfather to Bible class. One of the few times in his life he had entered into a church building, and he heard this chapter read and he obeyed the gospel because it emphasizes the deaths of all these great men, all these patriarchs. So that's a part of it, but there's more to it than just that principle that yes, we all die. There's this specific question that actually impinges on the whole issue of the antiquity of mankind. And also at the same time, as we pointed out last study, the age of the earth. Because those two things must be considered together, biblically speaking. Because man goes back to the very beginning of time. First week of creation. So if we can establish the antiquity of mankind, Adam and his descendants, then we have thereby basically established the age of the earth. If you establish the age of the earth, I think you could assume you've established the age of the solar system. And as you view it, of course, in the framework of the Genesis record, there's just not wiggle room for many of these modernistic theories that would say that you see God operating by an evolution, a slow development of solar systems and worlds upon worlds, galaxies upon galaxies over billions of eons of years. Well, anyway, we've talked about that quite a bit. Let's get into some of the nitty-gritty a little bit. This is the generation the book, the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them. We've discussed that enough. I think we don't need to dwell on those principles. They are very relevant for today's topics about the division between the sexes. And blessed them and called their name Adam. Now, that is something we should just briefly note, that collectively the name of mankind, man and woman, male and female, collectively was Adam. So she was Mrs. Adam, he was Mr. Adam, you might say, which is a beautiful expression. In other words, man is basically what Adam means, man. In the day when they were created. All right, this is the introduction. Now, here's where we get into some controversial areas. I was looking at a book by one who had been a mentor. Was not a regular mentor. I've taken seminars and classes under him over the years. A brother from Abilene Christian University, Dr. J.D. Thomas. He's written quite a bit. I would describe Brother Thomas as, I guess you'd say, conservative, but kind of moderately so in some respects, in some areas of study. Overall, I would label him as a conservative, even though he was at Abilene. Abilene has a bad reputation recently because they've departed quite a bit. Many of their faculty members from the original charter of the school. Of course, there are Brotherhood School out in Texas, and at one time they told the line on biblical truth, but now they've compromised in many areas. Now, Brother Thomas lived quite a number of years ago, and I'm not even sure of his status. He may have probably has gone on to his reward. He was one of our luminaries back in the 60s, 70s, and maybe early 80s. In a book he wrote on the antiquity of man, he brought out some considerations. For example, he wanted to argue that what we know of as Bishop Ussher's chronology, the famous bishop of the Church of England who had sat down to calculate using the genealogies in Scripture until our day. And this basically led to about the year 4004 BC. That was his conclusion, Ussher's conclusion. The earth was created in the year 4004 BC. Well, Brother Thomas says, now everybody knows today you can't rely on Ussher. And the bad thing is, he said, he's the bane of many a commentary, and especially older versions of the Bible, because his chronological notes ended up in the margins of some of the earlier versions of the King James. And so it influenced many generations to think the earth was formed in 4004 BC. And that just can't be the case, he says. So I was really disappointed when I was looking through it. But then at the end, he goes back to say, but the evolutionists can't make their case that man is ancient, as per millions or hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, he seems to opt for a fairly young earth, maybe less than 10,000 years. He just didn't want to go with Ussher because Ussher had made some mistakes. Now, we don't carry a brief for Ussher necessarily. He didn't tell us what those mistakes were. So that was a fault, I think, in Brother Thomas's book, where he should have, when he asserted that, he should have shown some samples. But I think you could say, with Ussher, there have been some facts overlooked. For example, and this is, I don't want to get too much into details here, but it is worthy of note. We basically, in our King James Bibles, are following a text of the Hebrew that was, I think it would go back maybe to the Leningrad manuscript of 900 BC, basically. But the Leningrad manuscript is in that tradition known as the MT, or the Masoretic text, from the Masoretes, who earlier on were Jewish scholars who developed, the point system. Some of you heard about that. The original Hebrew consisted only of consonants and no vowels. But to remember how their fathers had pronounced words, they begin to put out, because the language is being lost in their normal speaking among themselves. They often use Aramaic and other things. So to remember biblical Hebrew, they came up with the points, the vowel point system. Masoretes were very good scribes, and they also copied manuscripts from other manuscripts. So what we have in the King James Bible, what we have basically in our English Bibles today, the main tradition we have is what we call the MT tradition, the Masoretic text. And that's fine. It's considered to be a really quality text. One of the things that has shown us that was, as I mentioned, the Leningrad manuscript, which was around the 10th century BC, or 80. Did I say BC? I mean 80. If I said BC earlier, I want to correct myself. AD. That this translation, which came almost 1,000, or manuscript almost 1,000 years after the time of Christ, has, for example, the book of Isaiah. And when we found the Isaiah scroll, which comes from the 2nd century BC at the Dead Sea area, and we compared the text of the Isaiah scroll with the Masoretic text tradition of Isaiah, the copy of Isaiah from over 1,000 years later, it's almost word for word verbatim. The changes are so minuscule as only to be worthy of note in scholarly circles and having no practical difference. So that tells us that the Masoretic text is a good text. But we know it's not necessarily perfect. And we also realize that somewhere in the 3rd century BC, in the 200s BC, in what has been reputed to be, this is according to tradition, but tradition may be fairly reliable. There were Hebrew scholars who were called into Alexandria. You know, there are many scholars. There was a famous library at one time in Alexandria, and who were asked to translate their sacred scriptures into the Greek language, because Greek was the lingua franca of the time. It was the predominantly spoken language of that era, the Mediterranean world, including in Egypt. At the time was what was the educated people spoke in Egypt, Greek. So they wanted to be able to read what the Hebrews had said. They thought it to be fascinating history. And they had these scholars to translate what we today know as the Septuagint. So it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And it's old. It goes back to about the 3rd century BC, the 200s, before the time of Christ. The reason why I bring all that up, and I didn't mean to go too far afield, is to say this. When you look at some chronologies, in other words, some of the dates that are assigned to the lives of some of these patriarchs in the Masoretic text, and compare those same dates or same men mentioned in the Greek translation tradition, there are some differences. In other words, the Greek tends to inflate it, and we get over 1,000 years more. So instead of 4,004, it'd be somewhere in the 5,000s that the earth was established, if that were the correct tradition. And see, that's a big if for us. And today we can only speculate. We don't know. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible came from a textual tradition that was very close to what we know as the MT, the Masoretic text, but there are some different. The book of Jeremiah is longer in the Greek than it is in the Masoretic text. Things of that nature. So we have to ask ourselves, were they onto something? Did those Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible in the 3rd century BC have access to a superior text? Were those numbers better? And is the earth just a little bit older than some conservative King James reading Bible scholars have thought? Well, that's just something to consider. And it's not definitive for this question, because you're still talking about an earth that's just a few thousand years. So instead of being 6,000 years old, talking about 7,000, a little bit over 7,000 years old. Minor point for the evolutionists, they think it's the difference between twiddly-dee and twiddly-dum, but it might be helpful for us for this reason. One of the things Brother Thomas brought up in his book on the antiquity of man is the fact that when you go to professional archaeology today, professional archaeologists, they often date sites that they are investigating and events that occurred in or at those sites, trying to study whatever they can find out about the events, the material evidence left behind. They will do that based on potology most of the time, the study of pottery. And you think that when I first heard about this, I was bored to tears when I had to study this at archaeology at the master's level a number of years ago. But I came to see the value of it, because what I didn't realize was just how accurate, pretty well accurate, the study of pottery forms and shapes and sizes and styles can be. It's almost like today, I may have mentioned this before, some of you ladies especially, if you were to take a bunch of pictures or photographs of ladies from the 21st and 20th centuries in the United States, let's just say in North America, and you were to see how they're dressed, you could pretty much put your finger on the probable era they came from. Almost immediately, if you saw a lady from the 1940s, you'd know what her hairstyle is going to look like, because we've watched enough classic films to get a handle on that, right? You know, and in the 50s it's different. Now there were some holdovers, and that's the rub here. There's the rub. There were some holdovers in the 50s who wore 40s style hairdo, just like I wear old style hairdo. I don't care anymore. But if you want to be stylish and trendy, you want to stay up with the time. So what do they crop their hair off a lot in the 50s and put on makeup that was like they painted the front of a building with gaudy paint? A lot. I'm being facetious. You could tell the 50s, you could tell the 60s, maybe not 1960, but 1965, you could tell from 1960. You know what I'm saying? And even into the 70s, some are really good at this, and they can get it down nearly to the year, or they can get out at least to the half a decade, I would say. Wouldn't you? Music styles, same kind of thing. Everything since about 1978 is cruddy. It's worthless. It's garbage.
You're talking about music?
music. And any sissy that listens to it, I feel for them, pity them. All the muscle music, just like the muscle cars, was made back in the 70s. So anyway, that's my plug there for our generation. But our time was different. Our music was different from the 40s. I like the big band era from the 40s too. I like that. Why do I bring all this up in this class? Because pots change. Ancient cultures used pots for just about everything. They didn't have metal. They did have metal, and some things were done through metallurgy. But most of their pots were made out of clay. That's just the way they did it. It was easy to get clay, and it's just a famous. It's almost it's almost iconic, the idea that pots were used in ancient culture, all sizes pots. But we can tell where they came from. The Greeks' pots did not look like Hebrew pots. They were made differently. Oh, you had to open at the top. You had a place to hold the liquid or the food or whatever grain. But they were made differently. One of the things we can see, for example, on the west coast of Palestine, the southwest coast, the area of old Philistia, today the West Bank, and it's still Palestinians, Palestine, Philistine, that's what Palestine comes from. It's a corruption of Philistine. So you have old Philistia, and their pots were Greek-like pots. They were like the Minoan pottery of the Mediterranean. They were not like the Semitic peoples who lived all around, the Amorites and the Jebusites. Their pots were not that much different from the pots of the Hebrews. Well, I shouldn't have gone too far off in potology. But the thing is, much of that can be dated. There are certain dates that can be pegged. In other words, you see the development of the pottery through the layers of the earth that are uncovered. You know that hundreds and even a few thousand years may pass in a given area, a site you're excavating. But some of the layers you can date with precision because they have to do with like destruction by fire. And in history when that city was destroyed by fire, the number of times you can compare the fire layers. And also earthquakes. Those earthquakes are pretty well documented by written records. So you can correlate the written records with these developments and get a pretty good idea of the pottery. But it isn't perfect. Why is it not perfect? Same reason why it's sort of subjected to go back and figure out which fashions are represented by a picture of a woman, say, with her hair done different. It could be 1961, and she could still be wearing a 1944 hairdo, right? I mean, that's not out of the question. But overall, we see the development. So pottery is a pretty good way to date things, but it isn't flawless. And furthermore, in recent years, much of archaeology has deviated from the original impetus or motivation. Archaeology in Syria and Palestine in the earliest stages was almost always motivated by Bible scholars, historians who wanted to know if you could corroborate the biblical accounts with the material remains left behind. So that was their motive. They would have the Bible in one hand and the spade in the other. That's the figure we often see. The Bible in one hand, the spade in the other. And they of course, did corroborate all of these events that are mentioned in the Bible. When I say all, there are some that are still yet to be corroborated. They're minor events, but the majority of the major big events have been corroborated. But in recent years, Syro-Palestinian, that is Syria-Palestine archaeology, has been taken over by a bunch of thugs, such at the University of Arizona and others. I call them thugs, scholarly thugs, because they come in with another agenda. They want to use archaeology now not to confirm the Bible, but to try to tear it to pieces. So their hidden agenda is we come in with a naturalistic worldview. We're evolutionists. We believe the earth has been. So we're going to come in and try to find ways to disparage the biblical account. Now, not all of that. There are still some good archaeologists, some good biblical archaeologists out there. And there's still a fairly objective practice of archaeology. But you do have to be careful and discriminate. All that said to say, as Brother Thomas was quoting sources in his book, archaeologists seem to think the cultures we can study, many of them date back at least to 7,000 or 8,000 years before the time of Christ. That would be too early given the Masoretic text. And even in the case of 8,000 years, too early. Well, actually, that would still be too early either way for the biblical chronology that we're going to talk about. So I would say that we have to be very cautious. But in the end, my inclination is to try to remain as objective as possible with the biblical chronology. I did not say genealogy. For this simple reason, that word has kind of had a bad rap lately. Genealogy is thought of as inherently unreliable or full of gaps. Again, our brother Thomas had to point out, oh, there are gaps. There are gaps here and there. David was the son of Abraham, who was the son of Adam. It's mentioned, I think, on one of the accounts. Well, obviously, some people got left out with duh. Brother Thomas, we're not looking at things like that that are obvious, and no one disputes that there are some lists where there are some gaps. And those things are so obvious, nobody would ever had a second thought about that and thought, wait a minute, you left somebody out. They knew what he meant. He's just jumping back to the main descendants to the past. But we can't do that in Genesis 5. I guess I said all that to say this. And I said last week to remind us, if you want to have hundreds of thousands or millions of years of time squeezed into biblical chronology in some way to accommodate the modernist views, you would have to do it before Genesis chapter 2 and 1, 2 and following. A gap theory between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. You have to do it during the creation week, a day-age theory. The days have to be hundreds of thousands or millions of years each day and night. Or you have to do it sometime after Genesis chapters 1 and 2, the creation account that is mentioned twice in different ways, Genesis 1 and 2. So this is what we're looking at now, the approach where some say, well, we must be able to squeeze it in with genealogies. We noticed last week, genealogy. So we go back and we know that from our time until Christ was 2,000 years, roughly speaking. From Christ to Abraham, 2,000 years, roughly speaking. Now the question is how far back, how many years from Abraham back to Adam? Well, Enoch was the seventh from Adam. We have 20 generations listed by Luke and from Adam till Abraham in Luke chapter 3, which means you only have 13 generations to play with and squeeze in eons of time. But can we do that? Well, often many will try to do that before those 13 generations. They'll go back and say it's right here. We squeezed it in right here in Genesis 5. Let's see how it's written. Can this be done? Verse 3, and Adam lived 130 years. Now, how old was Adam when he lived until something's about to be mentioned that happened? What did he just say?
130.
130 years. Peg that in your mind. Something's going to happen at 130 years. And begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. Now, we've mentioned Seth back in the last chapter, the son of promise. So Seth was born when? How old was Seth? How old was Adam when Seth was born?
130 years.
How do we know?
Just said it.
Well, it says he lived 130 years, and he begat a son.
Okay, well, maybe.
He lived 130 years.
Well, it sounds like it grammatically.
Yeah, why would he say he lived? He begat Seth. Would that make any sense to just bring out arbitrarily one? Obviously not. Everybody can see what he's doing. It would take only a fool who deliberately wants to misunderstand. There are some who do, to say, oh, we can't get any chronology. We're going to see where the chronology lies. He begat a son, so he called his name Seth. All right. In the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth. How many days before he begat him? It was 130. So after how many? 800 years. And he begat sons and daughters. So you total that up, verse 5, and all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Fair enough. Somebody says, but there could have been all these gaps. Well, okay. We saw he was 130 years old and begat Seth. Now, what about Seth? Seth lived 105 years. And what happened then? After 105 years, of course, Adam would still be alive, wouldn't he? He'd still be alive, his father Adam. And begat Enos. And Seth lived after he begat Enos 807 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. So a ripe old age too. But then we have these pegs. We're hanging these dates on these pegs on the wall of chronology. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. And Enos, who's Enos? Well, he's the son of Seth, who was born when Seth was how old? 105 years old. So disregard now for this moment how long Seth lived. Now let's look at Enos. He lived 90 years and begat Canaan. So it looks like they're getting to be fertile younger and younger. I'm just kidding. So he's 90 and begat Canaan. all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. Okay, 850. And Enos lived after he begat Cain 815 years. Verse 10, he begat sons and daughters. And all his days were 905. And he died. And Canaan, now who's Canaan? The son of, oh, there must be gaps in between. How do you squeeze gaps in between these? Betty, could you squeeze any gaps in here? And be fair with what the text is saying? You take a bonehead, and there are some like that. I hate to say it, but it's true. Who would say, but we don't know. There could have been some other sons in between. Well, how would that work out with the chronology? You're just completely disregarding, and this is chronology. The time that someone was born, and then he died, and then when that someone who was born, how old he was when his next son was born, and he died. So let's go down, and so we're just reading. Canaan lived 70 years and begat Mahalalel, and Canaan lived after he begat Mahalalel 840 years and begat sons and daughters. All the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. And Mahalalel lived 65 years and begat Jared. Mahalalel lived after he begat Jared 830 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. And Jared lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. So disregard my theory that they were having kids earlier. Some of them waited a while. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Now, I know this sounds boring, but remember, according to the anecdote that I related to you, it converted an old man who came to church for the first time in years, and he died. At least let that part sink in. But actually, this is fascinating history, and we're reading this for a point, for a very good purpose. All right, verse 21, and Enoch. So look at verse 19. And Jared, or 18, and Jared lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. Again, why is that significant? Well, somebody alleges there are all these gaps. Actually, Enoch is called the seventh from Adam. In the book of Jude 14 and 15, he's called the seventh from Adam. Go back and count the fathers, and you go to Adam, and he's the seventh from Adam. Exactly what Jude said. I would say now here's the question, if we take the Bible seriously, which means when it intends to speak in literal terms, to portray things in straightforward language, non-metaphorical language, non-figurative language, that's how we take it seriously. Let it speak for itself. Then we have to see that there are chronologies established here. Now you can go to these chronologies, and you can come all the way to Noah. I mean, I don't mean to disparage it. We could read it all. Well, we could read it all. Let's just read on down. Well, let's go ahead and read it. We're so close. All right. I'll read it so nobody will think that I'm deliberately leading it out to pull the wool over your eyes. Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God, and he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. Now that's a pregnant statement, full of meaning. Verse 22. It's going to be brought up again in verse 24. Enoch walked with God. That's not said yet. It will be said later about somebody else. It's not said about these men, is it? That particular phrase. There was something unique about Enoch. He was a special person. So special, we're going to find out he had a very different kind of ending from most men who live. So he walked with, all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And then he died. It doesn't say that. You remember how it says, and he died, and he died. And it says, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not. What does that mean? Well, he explains why he was not. It didn't say he died. It just said he was no longer here. That's the idea. He was not on the earth. Why? For God took him. Oh, he killed him? No, he didn't say he died. He said he took him. So we could spend a whole lesson, I have in fact, walking with God and what that beautiful expression means. And we're going to see in the case of Noah, it's used and what it means for Noah when the writer says he walked with God. So we could assume it means the same, and it meant the same for Enoch. Anyway, he was translated, we say, into heaven directly. He did not die as mortals do, but he obviously was translated. His body was transformed to conform to the celestial realms. He's with God now. I wish I could have lived in such a time as that and lived such a good life. You're so devout. You're so devout. You're so pious that God actually wants you. It's like, I'm not going to wait for you to, and I'm not going to make you die, which is the result of the curse, the consequence of the curse. You're going to come up, just come on, be with me.
Really quickly, I don't want to chase a rabbit about this, but that made me think, did Enoch not actually have to go to paradise? Is he in heaven, literally with God, instead of having to go to paradise and await the judgment, like all other men?
Well, it just says God took him.
Oh, it doesn't say where he took him.
No, it doesn't say, it doesn't give us enough clues to,
New Testament
can't answer one way or the other.
where he went, he just took him away. Put him somewhere. Never mind.
God took him off the earth. So he is either in the blessed compartment of Hades. Later it would be known as Abraham's bosom. Not yet, because Abraham is not yet born. It wouldn't be called that yet. But we don't know, Loretta. We can only speculate, so can't go any farther. I don't know how to go any farther than that and answer the question. All I know is he had a blessed relationship with God, a special one, so that he was no longer on the earth. I don't think he's out in limbo just floating around space. I think he's in a secure, blessed place of bliss. Anyway, let's move on. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And Methuselah, who was his son, lived 187 years and begat Lamech. And Methuselah lived after begat Lamech 782 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. What's significant about that, by the way?
It's the oldest man in everything.
Well, how do you know that?
Bible says, well,
Where does it say that?
Well, we can count and do that.
That's a good point, right? I mean, I'm glad I asked that. We can count. That's how we derive that witticism that even little kids know. The oldest man that ever lived, yet died before his father, who was Enoch. How was that? How did he die before his father? Well, that's not really accurate to say it that way. It's misleading. What we mean for kids is his father never died. His father never died. Enoch didn't die. So that's what we mean when we use that expression or ask that riddle. The oldest man that ever lived but died before his father. Anyway, we know he's the oldest because we just count the numbers. And the writer expects us to count the numbers. That's why he listed them. And all the days of, okay. And Lamech lived 182 years and begat his son. Now we're going to have a little bit of history here about this guy. Well, actually, we're just going to have the fact that he has a very special son. And he called his name Noah, saying, this same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed. He didn't know just what that meant. I'm sure he thought that was kind of predictive prophecy. He didn't know just how true that would be, that Noah was going to be a blessing to humanity. In fact, he would save humanity, he and his righteousness in his household. And Lamech lived after he begat Noah 595 years and begat sons and daughters, and all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. And Noah was 500 years old and begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth. What's so important about these three? I was watching a talk show host. Well, actually, my grandkids were watching it. They're boring, and they went back and watched some old Jeopardy or something. Anyway, the category was the Bible. Immediately, most of the contestants, who were real brainiacs, I mean, they were stumped. Who were the three sons of Noah? That was one of the questions that came up. All the smart people. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They missed it. I thought, really? Of course, my grandkids got it, but that's just another illustration of the dearth of Bible knowledge in our time. And they know all about, operas and artwork and things from medieval times. They know all of that really nerdy stuff, but they didn't know that. But we do, and it's important because every one of us comes from one of these three sons. We will see that as we continue to study the text, that all the earth is going to be destroyed. That's the big event coming up in chapter 6 down to 9. And that every person on earth will be destroyed. All the lineages will be wiped out except for the lineage of Noah, his three sons. So all humanity has been populated by Noah's family. Shem, the Shemitic people, just drop the H sound, Semites. And that's not just Hebrews. We're talking about anti-Semitism. That's not fair because Semites are a much broader category. Many more descendants of Abraham. Ironically, including many Arabs. They wouldn't like that. They're Semitic. Ham Basically, people from, many of them from the Mediterranean, but how they end up there. Canaanites, many Canaanites were Hamitic, and also from North Africa, from Africa. Many were descendants of Ham, but some ended up in the Mediterranean, like the Philistines, ethnically were Hamitic. But culturally, they were influenced by the descendants of Japheth, who would populate Europe, the steppes of northern Europe. Well, Europe, up above the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and then go to the west and go all the way through Europe, Greece especially. All right, so my point I want to make about chapter 5 is this. We have a pretty tight chronology. And we can continue through the book of Genesis, and we'll try to do that as we go through, make notes of it. And we can see after Noah's sons lived, we can derive more chronologies up until the time of Abraham. And what have we already established? Well, Abraham lived about 4,000 years ago from our standpoint. So if we could squeeze in we only get about 2,000 to 3,000 years prior to that. The earth biblically is very young. Now let's just stop and think about what this means. You see, I have spent many years trying to help my brethren understand, and I'm not the only one, many have done this, by the way, understand we've got to defend the concept of biblical inerrancy. And that word just means without error, inerrant, not errant. A Bible that does not affirm mistakes. The scripture text does not affirm statements or make statements that do not correspond to the facts. And yet here's a test case, because if there are, in fact, insurmountable evidences that the earth is hundreds of thousands or even millions of years old, well, you can see where this all leads, right? And this is why all those theories we looked at in the beginning of the class have been brought up. They have been invented to try to solve this problem for those who want to have their cake, interpretive cake, and eat it too. They want to be able to allow and to concede, yes, there have been millions of years of antiquity of man, but the Bible is also true. But you can't literally make that true. You've got to make a decision. Either the biblical text or the modernistic chronologies of millions of years. You can't have both. Those other theories just don't work. So what do? Well, we have to be prepared here. There's much work to be done in this area. When I was studying for the doctorate at Ambridge, many of my professors were very scholarly in the Old Testament. I bring this up from time to time in some of the classes, like in archaeology. Would you comment, Professor, I would ask, about some of these issues, the chronologies in Genesis 5 and the rest of the book of Genesis, how you relate those to the allegations made of the antiquity of man, of a really ancient human race? They would kind of hee-haw around. I'm not in any way trying to badmouth these men and to make it sound worse than it was. But many of them, I guess, were just caught off guard, and they would say, well, I'd have to get back to you on that one. And they just didn't want to discuss it. Now, some of our brethren have. For example, Apologetics Press, years ago, when Brother Wayne Jackson was alive, was very willing to engage the Brotherhood and others outside the Brotherhood on such questions, and they did. And Brother Jackson was very good about defending the literal ages of a few thousand years old for mankind. But then this brings us right back to the allegations. And if you as soon as you flip to YouTube, start bringing up any kind of, you search anything similar to this question, you're going to get all kinds of videos, some good quality, some horrendously bad, and everything in between, talking about the antiquity of man. They're going to assert, well, we know the earth is millions of years old because of this, this, and this. Usually they'll bring up things like the old standbys, radiometric dating, and so on. We've all heard of that. The isotopes of certain elements will deteriorate at a known level, they will assume, and we can see what their half-life is, and then we can extrapolate back, see how old the sample from which a given isotope is taken or element is taken, and we have to make a lot of assumptions like how much was probably in it to begin with, like carbon-14. Now, that's for much more recent type of study. They all pretty much mostly admit you can't go back too many thousands of years for carbon-14 dating, which is supposedly left over in living organisms, and then it begins to deteriorate at known rates. And so you can know how long something's been dead and know how long ago it lived. But the problem is the assumptions are just so untenable many times that we know exactly how much carbon-14 was already in the sample to begin with, and we assume also that it always deteriorates at a known rate, when as a matter of fact it may not, because there are empirical studies showing that at times the rate is accelerated, at times it's retarded. So this means it's really difficult to put all your eggs in that one basket, radiometric dating. And I bring it up because they're almost all creationist scientists, like here's R.L. Wissong, will deal with this. Now, he deals with things like that extensively and will show the fallacious reasoning involved in their positive evidences for an ancient Earth, the evidences they set forth. When it comes down to this question, then we have to call upon our intelligent people, and all are, obviously, in the brotherhood, but I mean those who have the time and the inclination and maybe the aptitude, and they have a special gift for it, to go out and research this sort of scientific thing and find out about the age, the chronologies and chronometers and what empirical data out here would help us to solve this issue. So I would encourage more of our brethren to go into that, but to do that with your head screwed on straight. Because too many go into these, they go to secular universities where they're just rife with materialistic philosophy to start with. And all they get are going to be the contrary points of view. And they will not hear fairly and objectively a defense of a young earth based on empirical studies. But they're here. I mean, it's hard to know what to select. There's so many. And they are very controversial. And here's the problem, and this is true of science in general. Science, in a sense, is dynamic. Science is a discipline. It's dynamic. In this sense, it's just a collection of human beings who've come up with collective knowledge or wisdom, hypotheses, theories, and some established principles or fact. They're pretty good at it for a while, but then things change. Now, I'm not going to go with Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, who's pretty much a harbinger of postmodernism. You just will to select either this paradigm or that paradigm, but it's all a matter of you select paradigms and you rule out the other. One paradigm will overcome the other. And it's very sociological. This age believes that, but then the next age adopts another one. I just don't go with Kuhn on that. I think there are changing paradigms, but often that's because the evidence will force the change of the paradigms. Let me give a case in point. Now, this is very controversial for some. But before the moon landings, man on the moon in the late 1960s, there were, in fact, and I know you will hear this disputed, the liberals today will say, oh no, they never did this, but they did do it. It's there, it's documented. There were many who worried that the moon landing vehicle would sink into the dust, moon dust, that the moon dust would be several meters thick, and that when the little lander landed on it, the pods were just not wide enough on its feet, and it was going to sink all the way down because it's just like really talcum powder type dust. Where did they get the idea that there would be all this moon dust? And really think about it. Based on their earlier premises, it was not a stupid conclusion.
They thought the universe was millions of years old, and it would all be settling for millions of years, right? I guess. Maybe I'm being...
Settling?
Not settling, but accumulating.
How would moon dust accumulate?
Well,
think about it. You were talking about moon dust. At least we're not talking about tar dust. We're talking about moon dust. How does moon dust accumulate? Well, what's out there in the solar system? All kinds of dust. Particles are everywhere. What happens when they come to Earth? Most of the time, when they hit our atmosphere at high velocities, they're burned up. Most of them. A few big chunks make it through. And big chunks hit the moon sometimes, but most of this dust. So there's cosmic dust everywhere. And we can't, using the same sorts of uniformitarian type methods that evolutionists have used through the years, and this is what evolutionists did. They said, as we examine the amount of dust out there in the moon, of course, as it travels around the Earth, and the Earth and moon revolve around the sun, is picking up all this dust, and it has no atmosphere. to speak of. So there's nothing to burn it up. The dust is going to accumulate on the moon and pile up. So if the moon is millions of years old, the dust would be very thick. That's a logical conclusion, because we know of no mechanism that would remove the dust. No water that would erode it on the earth and on the moon, and none that has been active on the moon for a long time in a liquid state. So that was the conclusion. Now, I say this, it's sort of spectacular, sensational to say we thought the first moon landing of manned vehicles would sink. Actually, we knew that it wouldn't, because we had sent some probes earlier, unmanned probes. But prior to that, they thought they would, but then they figured, even that, they said Neil Armstrong did have some reservation. He thought when he stepped on the moon, he might sink a lot more than he did, but it's just a few inches deep. Or it's not that deep at all. You remember the boot prints in the moon. All right, well, there has been since then a paradigm shift, you could say, in that regard. They don't use the moon dust as an argument in the favor of an ancient moon, because if the moon dust were meters and meters thick, that would be pretty good evidence for an ancient moon. Of course, today, usually the response is, we never said that. We never thought it had that much dust, but they did. It's select the way they go back. They just try to ignore. Oh, some early thinkers thought there might not be as much dust, so they were right out after all. But the average theory of evolution is positive, a lot of moon dust. But that's just one. And these guys use many others, often based on these same types of consistent natural law or uniformitarian assumptions that are used in science, and they get completely different results from what you would get if the Earth were millions of years old. This guy here, he's throwing out all these different dating methods that seem to be in favor of, well, I didn't use them all. Delta filling. The Mississippi River dumps about 300 million cubic yards of sediment into the Gulf of Mexico each year. If that river were millions of years old, the Gulf would have been long since filled. By measuring the rate of growth of the delta, about 250 feet per year, its age calculates to about 4,000 years. But the evolutionists, then they attack us when we say this in the same way we attack them with radiometric dating. They would say, but you're making some assumptions that the rate was the same. Deposition of the sediments, about 250 feet per year, has gone on from time immemorial. Fair enough. But we're doing just what? We're just taking your methodology, showing many specifics do not yield your long dates following your methodology. Ocean concentrations: uranium, sodium, nickel, magnesium, silicon, potassium, copper, gold, silver, mercury, lead, tin, aluminum, carbonate, sulfate, chlorine. Wow, that's a long list. I'm not going to read them all. There's just many others, he said. In the oceans are much less than would be expected if these elements and compounds were being added to the oceans at the present rate. How are they added today? Erosion. Rivers and streams erode these elements out of the earth, out of the dirt, and they end up in the ocean. Some, for example, nitrates and uranium do not break down or recycle like salt. So they should be there. It should be large quantity. The small concentration then taken as an accurate indicator that the oceans are a few thousand years old. Erosion, he goes on, let's see. Dendrology, tree rings and studies. There is apparently no reason why they cannot live for tens of thousands of years. Some species of trees, the bristlecone pines, isn't that spooky to me? They're out west, some of them. Spooky pine trees. Hey, brother. And they live to be over thousands of years. They're thousands upon thousands, multiple thousands of years. History. If man has been here for millions of years, why do we only find records of man dating to about 3000 BC? Well, the stock answer, what is that? You know what that is. Well, he was so stupid he didn't leave any written record till about 3,000 years. What about material range like, where you excavate occupation sites? Why do you not find occupation sites, in archaeology that go back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years? Even with the most sanguine of the liberal views of archaeology, you can't squeeze that much time into it. That's a pretty good argument. Sea ooze. I'm not familiar with all these. When plants and animals die in the sea, they build up an ooze on the floor. I have seen that lately when they've talked about that submersible that imploded. Many of them, some of the divers talk about all the snow that comes down, how much snow was on these parts. So they knew snow with quotation marks. They knew that this was recent wreckage, hadn't been there a long time, or it would have more snow on it. The snow, what are it's just particles that drift down from near the surface of plants and animals that die and they disintegrate and their particles just you see it in the light. It looks like snow in the light. You wouldn't see it in the darkness. Okay, well that creates sedimentation on the floor. When plants and animals die in the sea, they build up an ooze on the floor of the oceans at the rate of about 1 inch every 10 to 5,000 years. When this ooze is measured, there is not nearly enough on the ocean floor to count for thousands of millions of years. He even mentions the spin of the earth. The rotation of the earth is gradually slowing, losing time. A recent article in Popular Science talked about that. And that was, well, that's recent. That was 1973. It's called The Riddle of the Leap Second in Popular Science, the 2002 version, or edition of 1973. There's another one in Time magazine in 1966 dealing with the same issue. Now, I haven't looked into that before, but it seems to be able, they seem to know that they can measure the rate of the Earth's spin and that it's measurably slowing down. So you just extrapolate back in the past, a few thousand years ago, it had to be made. Because if you assume that it's slowing down at a known steady rate, it would have been spinning so fast before it'd be absurd. Things like that. Influx of cosmic dust. And it's harder to measure on Earth because of water and wind and atmospheric erosion. But the moon was a pretty good one before. But he mentions here something, the decay of the Earth's magnetic moment. To me, that's always been a more convincing one. But I know that a lot more scholarly research has gone into it by Dr. Thomas Barnes from the University of Texas at El Paso at the time. He had been a professor there on the Earth's magnetic field, and it's disintegrating at a known quantifiable rate. So extrapolate back in the past that the Earth, based on the magnetic field's deterioration, could not be more than about 10,000 years old. Now that's the upward number. That doesn't mean that we're adopting that number for the age of the Earth, given the text we read. So to sum it all, I just say a lot needs to be done. We need to prepare ourselves in this area, and I would encourage some here who have that been of mine and who have an interest in this to look more into it. And there's a lot of pro and con material out there. But I think enough is available for us to have an intellectually satisfying, you might say, conclusion that the evolutionists, when they allege millions of years for the age of the Earth and man, have not established their case. They have not set forth evidences that are insurmountable. On the other hand, creationists have set forth a number of very strong evidences supporting a young Earth, a young solar system, a young universe. So that we don't have to kowtow to their chronologies. We can accept the biblical chronology. Now, not all of my brethren would say that. All of my preaching brethren. Some would still try to hold with the evolutionists and still try to squeeze in millions of years. Loretta gave me a book the other day, a nice book. Stephen Meyer, many of you are familiar with Stephen C. Meyer. He has his PhD from Cambridge in the philosophy of science. He's from the Discovery Institute in Seattle. They're a good group. They've done a lot of really scholarly work in what they call intelligent design. We used to call it creationism, but they balk at that because it's association with, well, anyway, that's another story. But they balk at that terminology. And Meyer and others have always hedged their bets. They want to say the Earth is millions of years old. Oh, but we don't believe in theistic evolution. In fact, he co-edited this thick volume. It's about 1,000 pages, by the way. She gave me, thank you, Loretta, for that. He co-edited about 1,000 pages refuting theistic evolution. And yet, in the end, he adopts theistic evolution light, in my opinion. And that was my terminology. Anyway, enough. Sorry to go over. But I appreciate y'all's attention here. Any questions or comments before we dismiss? Need to get back on track. We have fellowship meal coming up.